My mother didn't pause. She didn't soften her voice or search for kinder words. She simply looked at me across the kitchen table and said, "Kendra's wedding is the family's priority. We can't come to yours." No hesitation. No apology. My father studied his hands as if the answer lived somewhere in his knuckles. Kendra sat across from me and smiled the way people smile when they've already won something they never had to fight for. I stood up, gathered what remained of my composure, and walked out of that house carrying a weight I had been trained since childhood to treat as normal. That night, I didn't argue. I didn't plead or call back with a softer version of myself. I simply opened a door they didn't know existed, and what waited on the other side was the one thing they had never once taken the time to ask about. I grew up in a house where love was allocated by convenience. If something required the least disruption, the least planning, the least emotional effort, it was considered fair. And somehow, in every version of fair my parents constructed, the easier choice was always my younger sister, Kendra. She was the bright one, the effortless one, the child whose smallest milestone was treated as a reason to decorate and celebrate. My accomplishments were acknowledged with polite nods. Hers were met with candles, phone calls, and a pride so loud it filled the room entirely. You'd think that dynamic quietly corrects itself as children grow into adults. It doesn't. It only sharpens, grows quieter in its cruelty, and begins to feel like climate rather than choice. When I was 16, I watched my mother trim a family photograph, literally crop the frame to make it fit a smaller picture holder. My shoulder remained in the image. My face did not. She laughed it off the way she laughed off most things involving me, waving a hand and saying, "Oh, honey, you're still there," before moving on as if she hadn't just edited me out of proof that we were a family. I remember staring at that cropped white edge for a long time, understanding something I hadn't had language for before. I could work harder than anyone. I could shine brighter, achieve more, build more, and I would still be the part someone felt comfortable removing when the frame got too small. That realization didn't break me. It focused me in ways that probably frightened people who expected me to fold. I pushed myself through scholarships, through sleepless nights building a supply chain platform from nothing but a flawed idea and an internet connection, through investor meetings where men in expensive chairs told me my numbers weren't believable. I held on when the logic said to quit, not because I was reckless, but because failure meant returning to a version of myself that had been cropped out of the picture. Success was the first place where no one could edit me. And when the platform scaled, when the acquisition offer arrived and the number on the page stopped feeling like fiction, I didn't rush home to show my parents. I sat alone in my apartment while the city hummed beneath my window, and I let the quiet confirm what I had suspected for years. Some people only celebrate you once your success makes complete sense to them. Mine never did. Still, even knowing that, I held on to the belief that my wedding would be different. Adrian Steadywar was the first person who had ever told me, without conditions or caveats, that I didn't need to earn my place beside him. He asked me to marry him in the simplest, most unhurried way, and I said yes while the room felt lighter than any room I had stood in before. I planned the ceremony months in advance. I mailed the invitations myself, tucking pressed olive leaves into each envelope because I wanted every detail to carry intention. When I handed my parents their envelope across the same kitchen table where so many things had been decided without me, they smiled politely, their eyes already drifting toward the television behind my shoulder. "Of course we'll be there," Mom said, the way someone promises a thing they fully intend to forget. I spent weeks imagining all four of us in one place again, even briefly. I constructed a version of that day in my mind where the distance between us closed, just enough to mean something. Then Kendra announced her wedding date. Same month, same weekend. Eventually, as these things tend to go in families arranged around a single son, the same day. She called it destiny. My parents called it practical. I recognized it as the final data point in an experiment I had been running my entire life, the one measuring exactly how much I could matter to the people who were supposed to love me most. The first fracture announced itself on a Wednesday afternoon 2 weeks after Kendra's announcement. I was in my workroom finalizing the seating chart when my mother called, her voice wearing that particular practice softness she deployed whenever she had already made a decision and needed me to confirm it for her. "Sweetheart, we've been talking. Kendra's fiancé's family can only do that weekend. You know how she is emotionally. Could you adjust yours?" Adjust. As if a wedding were furniture to be repositioned. As if mine hadn't been planned and printed and mailed and dreamed over for months already. I pressed calm into my voice and told her the invitations had already gone out. There was a pause, careful and thin, before she said it. The thing she had been saying to me in 100 different configurations my entire life. "You're strong, Amber. You'll understand. Your sister would fall apart if we didn't go to hers." I watched the dusk settle across the city through my window. It wasn't the request that stung. It was the assumption beneath it, the familiar choreography I had been dancing to since I was old enough to notice. Kendra wants something. Everyone around her quietly repositions to accommodate it, even if that means moving me entirely out of the frame. Dad called later that night. His tone carried the apologetic weight of a man who has disagreed with a decision but lacks the will to say so. "You know how your mother worries. If we choose yours, Kendra will take it personally. You'll be fine." That last line, "You'll be fine." Their blessing and their dismissal condensed into 4 words, delivered with the warmth of a form letter. For days after that conversation, the tension sat beneath everything like a low hum I could never quite locate. Kendra sent me a text, bubbly, unguarded, entirely unaware. "Isn't it wild? Our weddings are the same day. It's like the universe aligned us." I drafted 3 replies, deleted all 3, and set the phone face down. What could I have said that she would have understood? She had never grown up in a world where someone else's joy quietly consumed hers. She had never needed to develop the vocabulary for it. The official collapse arrived not with shouting, but with a text message on a quiet Wednesday night. Mom's words were brief and logistical, the tone of someone managing a calendar conflict rather than their own daughter's wedding. "After discussing it, we've decided we can't attend your ceremony. It's too much travel back and forth. We hope you understand." No apology, no regret, just logistics, my own professional language borrowed and applied to justify abandonment. I sat on the edge of my bed with the phone glowing against the dark, and I waited for the grief to arrive. Instead, something else surfaced, slow and steady and entirely familiar. Clarity. The kind that doesn't feel like revelation because it has been building for years beneath the surface of every accommodation you were asked to make. I typed back, "That's fine," and hit send. But as soon as the message delivered, I understood that wasn't an ending. Something in me had quietly stopped bending, and the sound of that breaking clean was the first honest thing I had felt in months. That night, while Adrian slept in the next room and the apartment held its silence, I opened my laptop and scrolled through contacts I hadn't reached in years. Rachel, Aunt Marion, Eli, people who had been present for the imbalance without ever naming it aloud. For the first time, I didn't feel like a child requesting a seat at a table that didn't belong to me. I felt like a woman deciding exactly who deserved one at mine. And the answer, clearly and without hesitation, was not my parents. The day the structure I had called family finally completed its collapse didn't look dramatic from any angle that mattered. There was no argument, no slammed door, no scene. Just a quiet morning and the sunlight crossing my kitchen counter at an angle that made everything look honest, and a message I reread until the words blurred. "We hope you understand." Not once had they asked how I felt. Not once had they paused to consider what it meant to look your daughter in the eyes and choose the path that required nothing from them. The longer I stared at that screen, the more I recognized that the collapse wasn't a current event. It had been happening for decades, in cropped photographs and redirected phone calls and 4-word dismissals delivered with apologetic tones. This morning was simply the moment I stopped performing the act of not noticing. I drove out to the edge of the city to a small overlook where the air felt less managed. Adrian came with 2 mugs of tea and the wisdom not to fill the silence. He had always understood that some moments needed room to breathe. They didn't even hesitate, I finally said. He exhaled slowly, looking out at the distance below us. Then stop waiting for them to choose you. I nodded and felt something settle in my chest with a weight that wasn't sadness. A shift, a lock turning. A boundary forming in the exact shape of every line that had been crossed without consequence. That night, long after he fell asleep, I opened the folder I had kept closed for months. The deed to the villa in Tuscany. My villa. 8 acres of olive groves, ancient stone walls, an open courtyard that felt like a place constructed for truth rather than performance. I had purchased it after the acquisition, partly because I needed a place that existed outside the version of myself that the world had been shaping since childhood, partly because I wanted somewhere that belonged entirely and unconditionally to me. I had never told my parents. The reason was simple. They had never asked. As I scrolled through the photographs, the golden hills, the long stone table positioned beneath lanterns that glowed like something remembered from a dream, a thought formed with the clarity of a pulse. I could build a different kind of wedding here. Not a performance staged for approval, not a competition dressed in white linen, but a gathering of people who came because they chose to. Because the destination meant something to them. Because I did. I messaged Rachel first. She called within minutes, no preamble. "Please tell me you're not canceling," she said. I told her I was moving it to Tuscany. She didn't hesitate, didn't ask for details, didn't question the logic. "Send me the date, I'll handle the family." By the following morning, the group thread had ignited. Eli booking flights. Aunt Marian asking about accommodations near the villa. Uncle Ray volunteering for setup before I'd even asked. No one inquired about my parents. No one needed to. Meanwhile, Kendra posted a countdown on her social pages. 5 days until forever. My parents flooded the comments with hearts and exclamation points and the breathless energy of people performing joy for an audience. Not one message to me. Not one. I watched it without the sting I would have felt a year earlier. Their choices didn't wound me this time. They clarified things. The next several days moved with the texture of intention. I finalized the courtyard layout, the long table stretching toward the olive grove, the lanterns that would glow at dusk, the stone arch threaded with wild flowers that had been growing on that property long before I owned it. Workers moved through the space, sanding stone, stringing lights, trimming branches back to let the evening air move freely. Every sound, every hammer strike and ladder scrape felt like a promise I was keeping to myself. I wasn't engineering revenge. I wasn't chasing a reaction. I was reclaiming the narrative of my own life, and Tuscany was where it would be rewritten in permanent ink. The morning of both weddings arrived with 2 different kinds of light. In Boston, the sky came in harsh and white and unforgiving, the color of a room where no one's entirely comfortable. In Tuscany, the sun spread across the hills like something poured slowly and without hurry, warm and golden, and indifferent to anything happening in any other city. I woke before dawn and stepped onto the terrace barefoot. The olive trees moved in the early breeze, their leaves catching and releasing the light the way they had long before I arrived, and would long after I was gone. Everything felt grounded in a way that had nothing to do with ceremony and everything to do with ownership. Not of land, but of a story. Back in Boston, the ballroom had begun its quiet unraveling. My cousin Eli sent a photo without commentary. Rows of chairs wrapped in white fabric, most of them empty. The kind of emptiness that embarrasses itself in a large room. He captioned it simply, "This is going to blow up soon." Rachel sent another image moments later. My parents standing near the entrance in perfectly pressed clothing, their smiles tight and confused in the way smiles become when the room doesn't match the plan. Kendra stood near the ceremony entrance refreshing the guest list on the wedding planner's tablet, her expression hardening each time the numbers failed to improve. "They must be running late," she said to her fiancé, but even she didn't sound entirely convinced. Meanwhile, in the Tuscan courtyard, Guests arrived breathless from travel and glowing with the particular energy of people who have chosen to be somewhere. Grandma Elise appeared in a soft blue dress with her silver hair pinned back using the olive sprig I had placed on her vanity that morning. She took my face in both her hands and said, "My girl, look at you. Look how far you've come." I felt my throat close around something I hadn't realized I was holding. Love that chooses to appear in person. Love that books the flight and adjusts the schedule and shows up before you ask. That love carries weight that no obligation can replicate. As the sun climbed, the courtyard filled with voices I recognized. Rachel wrangling her kids between the lantern posts. Uncle Ray greeting the musicians with the easy warmth of a man who is always glad to be wherever he is. Aunt Marion photographing the vineyard as though she were documenting something sacred, which perhaps she was. For the first time in my adult life, I stood at the center of a gathering not because the world had bent itself around me, but because I had built a world that didn't require bending at all. In Boston, the ceremony had begun its attempts to proceed. Kendra stood at the entrance to the aisle, her bouquet trembling slightly in her grip. The planner moved behind her in quick, tense strides. "Where is everyone?" she asked, her voice dropping to a sharp whisper. Her fiancé shrugged. My parents arranged their expressions into placid smiles that didn't reach their eyes. Then Rachel sent another photograph into the group thread, the one that everyone had muted for years out of a low-grade habit of checking without wanting to be caught checking. It showed me stepping into the courtyard, the Tuscan sunlight catching the silk of my dress. Behind me, guests rose from their seats beneath the grapevines. Lanterns burned softly in the late morning air. The hills stretched behind us like something from a painting that took centuries to get right. Within seconds, more images followed. Eli capturing the long table, the stone arch threaded with wildflowers. Grandma Elise laughing with both hands raised above her head as if she were giving thanks to the sky. Then a short video appeared. Adrian taking my hand, his voice low and steady as he moved through his vows, choosing his words the way he chose everything, without performance, without excess. In the Boston ballroom, someone gasped, loud enough to carry. My mother's face drained of its practiced composure. She gripped my father's sleeve so tightly his expression shifted. "Kendra," she whispered, barely above breath. "They're all in Italy." Kendra's bouquet dropped slightly in her hands, her breath caught, and for what I believe was genuinely the first time in her life, she stood in a moment that had been built entirely around her and felt completely alone inside it. My father looked around the half-empty room, his jaw working. "Why didn't anyone say they weren't coming?" he asked no one in particular. "Because they didn't owe you that," I thought from thousands of miles away. They owed themselves a wedding worth attending. In Tuscany, I didn't know the precise moment their ceremony collapsed, but I felt something shift through the courtyard just after I finished my vows. A stillness, not sadness, something closer to release. As if a final thread connecting me to the version of family I had spent years trying to deserve had quietly and cleanly separated. After the ceremony, we moved toward the long table beneath the olive grove. Guests settled into their seats, passing wine, clinking glasses, speaking in the overlapping voices of people who are genuinely glad to be in the same place at the same time. The sky deepened into amber. The lanterns lit one by one as the air cooled, carrying the scent of rosemary and warm bread and something older that belonged to the land itself. Adrian leaned close and said quietly, "They know, don't they?" I said yes. "They're seeing the life they never thought to ask about," he added. "And the life you chose instead of them." He paused. But it wasn't revenge. He was right. It wasn't. It was clarity served without apology in the form of a life they had no idea I had been building. Midway through dinner, my phone buzzed against the table. A message from my father. "Is this where you are?" Then one from my mother, her words arriving in the slightly fractured syntax of someone composing under shock. "Why didn't you tell us you had a place like this?" Then from Kendra, her tone stripped of its usual confidence. "Is this some kind of joke?" I placed the phone face down on the linen without responding. Rachel raised an eyebrow from across the table. "They're spiraling," I said. She asked if I was all right. I looked at the candlelight moving across the long table. the table I had built, the table filled with people who had rearranged their lives to be seated at it. "I've never been more all right," I said, and meant it without reservation. In Boston, what remained of the evening was a kind of quiet erosion. A guest whispered too loudly, "Didn't her family used to be much closer?" Another asked why everyone seemed to be in Italy. Someone showed the villa photograph to someone else. The caption reading simply, "Amber's Wedding, Tuscany." My mother sat down in her chair with a hand pressed to her sternum. My father rubbed both temples in the slow, methodical way of a man revising his understanding of something he thought he already knew. The wedding planner cued the band, and the music played, but it played into a room that had already decided the occasion wasn't what it had been advertised as. Kendra stood before a large mirror near the entrance, her reflection looking back at her in a perfect dress with perfect hair and an expression that had no category for what was happening. Then she said the thing she had never once been required to say in her life, the quiet, undefended truth that her reflection offered without softness. Everyone chose her. No scene, no collapse in the cinematic sense, just a sentence spoken aloud for the first time, arriving exactly one day too late to change anything. In Tuscany, the musicians played late into the evening under a sky the color of deep water. Adrian whispered something near my ear that was meant only for the specific silence between us. Grandma Elise pressed a hand to her eyes when the first dance ended, and the applause rose from the tables. Rachel's children ran barefoot between the lantern shadows on the old stone, and no one called them back. Every sound, every scrape of chair and clink of glass and burst of laughter, felt like something being restored rather than won. Later, as we walked the olive grove carrying candles whose flames bent gently in the night air, I found myself looking toward the horizon without longing, which was new. What I felt instead was the particular freedom of a person who has stopped returning to a door that was never going to open from the inside. Just before midnight, a final message arrived from my mother. "I hope you're happy." I read it once, set the phone in my pocket, and didn't reply, not from anger, not from strategy, but because I had finally understood something that I had spent my entire life seeking permission to believe. Happiness doesn't wait for their approval. It doesn't consult their calendar. It doesn't hold its breath waiting for the family to call it fair. The morning after, Tuscany felt different in the way a room feels different after a long window has finally been opened. Sunlight crossed the courtyard in slow lines, scattering gold across the stones where petals from the night before still rested undisturbed. Grandma Elise sat beside me on the terrace with a cup of something warm, watching the olive trees move in the early light, and said, "You built something beautiful, not just last night, your life." I didn't know I needed to hear that until the words had already landed somewhere permanent. Messages continued arriving through the morning. My parents in fragmented apology, Kendra insisting she hadn't understood, my father asking when we might speak properly. None of it carried urgency anymore. Their choices had already made their statement quietly, clearly, on a day when it mattered most. What concerned me now was the question of what kind of family I intended to build going forward. So I answered only one message, Rachel's. She had asked if we were staying. "Always," I wrote back. Adrian found me at the railing with his arm around my waist in a stillness that required nothing of me. "Whatever comes next," he said, "you're not walking into it alone." And for the first time in my life, I didn't need to verify that against past evidence. He had already shown up when it counted. The proof was standing in the courtyard behind us, still strung with lights, still carrying the scent of the night before. What I understood by the end of it was this. I had spent years trying to earn a seat at a table that was never going to be set for me, and the whole time, without announcing it, without asking permission or drawing attention to what I was accumulating, I had been building one of my own. 8 acres, ancient stone, olive groves that had been growing since before anyone in my family had a name anyone remembered, and a deed, filed and recorded, that required nothing from them and explained everything about where I had gone. They never knew to ask about the villa. They never knew to ask about the acquisition. They never knew to ask about the company or the contacts or the 7 figures that had quietly settled into accounts they would never be named on. They never asked because they were certain there was nothing to ask about. That certainty was the only inheritance they ever gave me. And it was, without question, the most useful thing they ever did.